All right, welcome to week 6, and this is lecture 1 of week 6, but it's lecture 13 overall. So we're nearing the end of the course. Only a couple weeks away, and we've been working to elevate our cultural intelligence at the same time raising significant and meaningful practical questions regarding cross-cultural engagement. As we lean into the last few weeks, I want to ensure you we will do our best to cover a variety of what I would consider to be practical topics that are consistent with the content of this course, the readings and the lectures, and the theological framework that we've discussed in relationship to this course. In this week's lectures, I want to address 3 particular topics I believe are relevant to the information that we've been sharing thus far. In this first lecture, I want to talk about managing change. I won't by any stretch of imagination cover everything regarding change management within ministry contexts, but I hope to at least scratch the surface to help us begin to think or imagine the kind of issues that we'll encounter in managing or negotiating change. In the second lecture, I will talk about one particular way of managing change cross-culturally through a practice friends of mine from Bakersfield, California coined, at least for me, and this may exist beyond them, but it was for me meaningful, and it's called exposure therapy, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And in the final lecture of this week, we're going to address the need of indigenous leadership in cross-cultural context and search for persons of peace within the contexts that we're stepping into. So let's start with change management. As I've read throughout the discussion boards, a common theme has emerged, and it is this sense that something needs to change within your particular ministry context to create space for meaningful cross-cultural engagement with the other, however you define the other within your context. The idea of change management is in itself a loaded term that I want to briefly parse out. Todd Bolsinger, in his book, Canoeing the Mountains, suggests that what is needed in times of change is leadership and not necessarily management. I couldn't agree with that more. Leadership is the means through which someone or someone's exercises a vision and a capacity to bring something into being that does not yet exist. For many, our churches, cross-cultural engagement requires leadership to shape a preferred future. However, management, as defined in Bolsinger's book, is a kind of stewardship, faithful tending to what is already there. I believe this is also necessary in bringing about change within the life of the church. Visionary leadership in the church is great, however, without the skill set to steward the current people being called into that vision, the visionary could very easily run toward change, only to discover that there's no one following them. Will we care enough to steward well the souls of those that will need will we care enough to steward the souls of those that will need to take the turn toward change with us? Leadership envisions a future that doesn't already exist and mobilizes people and resources to bring that future into being. Management stewards the lives of those through whom one seeks to bring the change, attending to their emotional and spiritual journey along the way, while at the same time attending to the faithful, patient presence of the Spirit within the community as a whole. Now, the specific change that in this class we are seeking is an increased capacity for local ministries and church contexts to engage cross-cultural relationships in meaningful and faithful ways for the sake of the mission of God as made known in the person of Jesus Christ. You'll need to take lead in this process, but ultimately it's not by an act of power as defined in the last lecture, by exercising our capacity to bring about a desired outcome by position, role, or authority, but through an intentional use of love's power, which is mutual flourishing of all involved. A quick note before we go any further, and I believe one that Livermore is helpful to bring to the forefront. That is, do not come to the people through whom you seek to bring the change as the enlightened one. I see this happen too often. It really messes up churches. I was thankful that all of my postgraduate work was done within a ministry context. This helped to ensure that what I was learning was immediately being interpreted and applied in a real context with real people. Those disconnected from church while learning how to deconstruct the church do damage to the church because they begin to stand outside the church as a critic and not as an advocate, family member, or trusted servant. Let me say that again. Those disconnected from the church whilst learning how to deconstruct the church do damage to the church because they begin to stand outside the church as critic, not as an advocate, family member, or trusted servant. We've gained knowledge over an 8-week period and learned to see things that beforehand we hadn't seen, and we must be careful not to run into our churches and expecting them to see what we didn't see prior to 8 weeks ago. This requires a genuine love for the people you serve and an empathy for their place in life and a willingness to be patient in the process of change. People are naturally averse to change anyway. This seems amplified in the church, where for all intents and purposes, they see it as the last place that they know what to expect, especially in older, more established contexts. You must see yourself as a fellow sojourner, a learner, and a friend along the way. It's the empathy that Livermore addresses in his text, needed as much for the ones that are being reached as much for the ones resistant to reaching out. Empathy demands that we go below the line in understanding what values are being threatened, what fears are being induced, and what worldviews are being challenged. Recently, I was teaching a Bible study to a bunch of police officers. The topic of America's greatness and the apparent younger generation's lack of appreciation for that came up. There was some frustrated tones, as you can imagine. And I love these people. These are good people. They're my friends. They have good hearts. They love Jesus. But I vehemently disagreed with a couple of them. But I didn't bash them as a person of authority. Instead, I just joined the conversation. I said, I sit each week with millennials, some of whom are no older than 20 years old. It's been challenging to me that America that they've experienced is different than the America that I grew up with. I grew up watching walls come down in a war that lasted months. They've grown up never remembering a time when we weren't at war. They've grown up fearing that at any time someone could walk in their school, begin shooting the place up, and kill lots of people. They've grown up fearing that you can't even stand alongside the path of a marathon without fearing for your life. They've grown up believing that overnight their parents can lose their house and their 401k. They've grown up experiencing the aftermath of a racism that laid under the surface, with the exception of Rodney King, for much of my childhood, to see Ferguson and multiple homicides, unjust, and the ballooning of imprisonment. Their America is different than ours, which is why they aren't losing their minds over Nike or Kaepernick. We have to empathize with them, not stand over them, and our desire to see change take place. And that conversation went very well, actually. The second thing I would say about managing change is a cross-cultural context is in what way do you or the people you are seeking to change through have meaningful relationships with those you're seeking to engage with. We all want to reach people in theory. An old church wants to reach young people. A white church in an urban corridor wants to reach its black neighbors. The rich church feels an obligation to do something about the poverty that is a couple blocks over from it. But are there any meaningful relationships, which is why we're going to have our conversation about persons of peace in just a little bit. Without relationships, change will be seen as an act of committee or program, without any clear process for engaging in meaningful relationships. The people will feel confused, and the leader will become frustrated because nothing is happening. Is there the will to do the hard work of finding ways to step into relationships with those we're seeking to reach and allow the relationships themselves to bring shape to the processes? Have you done a decent job of utilizing the text of Scripture as the imaginative means through which people begin to understand the urgency and priority of cross-cultural engagement in the mission of God? People have become so politicized in our culture that they often hear change through the lens of political bias. Cross-cultural engagement feels or sounds a lot like political correctness to some. Have you recognized the unique role as a pastor or teacher to subvert political ideology through faithful investment and use of the scriptural narratives? And then I would also say, never underestimate the power of critical mass when attempting to bring about change. The leader who stands by themselves, who pumps up their people with great and grand visions, but who has never coalesced people around that vision through intentional relational engagement, will be frustrated by their capacity to or the lack of capacity to move people? Who are the allies in your congregational setting currently? Who are the leaders that are sensing the same movement of the Spirit that you are? Who can you bring along in the process to help you share that vision and recruit others into that vision? Maybe it starts with a small group of dialogue around a book or a text or a set of biblical texts. Who's your coalition that will help exercise influence in various spheres? As we were seeking to change the culture in one of my previous churches to reach across the socioeconomic chasm that existed between our church, which was one of wealth, and those in our community, which was a lot of people who didn't have wealth. And again, they had not intentionally distanced themselves. Empathize. Make sure you give the benefit of the doubt. It was just something that sort of emerged. I allied myself with the lady in our congregation who led the local food pantry and the mission. A few teachers, influential in our congregation, but who were on the front line of dealing with the systemic poverty in our community. And our children's pastor, who at one point intentionally lived in the subsidized housing in the area. A coalition formed that started by partnering with the mission and then beginning an after-school program for kids that would begin young and helping them change their mindsets, inviting our people into real and meaningful relationships. So don't stand over them, stand among them. That's number one. Number two is establishing meaningful relationships with those you seek to reach. Number three is utilize the resources of Scripture and the spiritual disciplines for that sake. And then create a coalition of allies to help move toward critical mass. Now we're going to turn our attention to exposure therapy and then finally to persons of peace.